The corridors of power and the grand chambers of the British justice system have long been the arena for some of the most dramatic clashes in modern history, where reputations are forged, fortunes are lost, and the very fabric of public life is shaped. For years, a quiet but incredibly intense war has been brewing behind closed doors, pitting some of the most influential figures in the world against one another in a high-stakes battle of wills, resources, and ideologies. This is not merely a story about legal technicalities or courtroom procedures. It is a profound narrative about power, influence, and the relentless pursuit of truth in an age where information is the ultimate currency. To understand the sheer scale of what has just transpired, one must look back at the decades of friction, the deep-seated animosities, and the slowly building tension that finally culminated in an unprecedented showdown. It is a tale that involves household names, multi-million-pound legal machines, and a coordinated effort that many have described as nothing short of a massive, systematic campaign designed to alter the media landscape forever. As we peel back the layers of this extraordinary confrontation, we invite you to become a part of our growing community by subscribing to the channel, hitting the notification bell, and staying tuned as this intricate story unfolds piece by piece. Because the revelations that emerge from this definitive verdict will undoubtedly reverberate for many generations to come. To truly appreciate the atmosphere leading up to this monumental moment, one has to envision the immense pressure that has been weighing down on dozens of dedicated media professionals who found themselves squarely in the crosshairs of this legal onslaught. For months on end, the atmosphere inside the newsrooms and editorial offices was thick with apprehension and uncertainty. As individuals who had dedicated their entire lives to public reporting faced accusations that threatened to completely dismantle their careers and permanently tarnish their professional legacies. The sheer financial weight of the proceedings alone was staggering, creating an environment where only the most resilient could hope to survive the psychological and institutional strain. On one side stood a coalition of wealthy, powerful, and deeply determined individuals, including members of the global elite and high-profile celebrities who had long harbored a deep-seated resentment toward the traditional media establishment. On the other side were the journalists and editors who viewed themselves as the frontline defenders of public scrutiny, holding the line against what they perceived as a direct threat to the fundamental right of a free press to operate without fear or favor. The clash was inevitable, but nobody could have predicted just how far both sides were willing to go to secure a total and uncompromising victory in the highest court of the land. As the weeks of arguments and testimonies dragged on, the courtroom became a theater of intense human drama, where every piece of evidence was meticulously dissected and every witness was subjected to the most rigorous cross-examination imaginable. The public watched with bated breath as sensational allegations were hurled into the spotlight, creating a media circus that threatened to overshadow the actual legal principles at stake. This was a battle fought on two fronts, within the majestic, echoing halls of the High Court and out in the court of public opinion, where headlines clashed and narratives were fiercely contested every single day. The stakes could not have been higher, for a defeat for the media institution would not just mean a massive financial penalty, but it could have established a dangerous precedent, effectively chilling the investigative spirit and muzzling the voices that seek to hold the rich and powerful accountable. The tension was palpable, a suffocating cloud that hung over everyone involved as the legal teams prepared for the final, decisive judgment that would either vindicate years of journalistic practice or deliver a catastrophic, potentially terminal blow to one of the most prominent media houses in modern history. When the moment of truth finally arrived, it did so with a clarity and finality that sent shockwaves through the entire establishment, catching many seasoned observers completely off guard. Mr. Justice Nicklin stepped forward to deliver a written judgment of monumental proportions, a sweeping 436-page document that left absolutely no room for ambiguity, misinterpretation, or compromise. It was a total, unmitigated vindication for the journalist and a complete crushing defeat for their accusers, representing a dramatic turning point in a saga that had dragged on for years. Every single claim that had been meticulously leveled against the prominent publications was dismissed in their entirety, without a single caveat, exception, or qualifying condition to soften the blow for the claimants. For the reporters, editors, and researchers who had spent years living under the dark shadow of these career-destroying allegations, the reading of the verdict was a moment of profound relief and overwhelming triumph, signaling the end of an agonizing chapter and the beginning of a major celebration. The ruling did not just clear their names, it effectively dismantled the entire core of the case that had been built against them, exposing the foundational weakness of the arguments that had been presented with such immense confidence by some of the most famous individuals on the planet. The staggering scale of this legal warfare becomes clear when one looks at the astronomical financial resources poured into the battle, with the total costs on both sides skyrocketing well past £50 million. For the publisher, Associated Newspapers, this was an existential fight that required funding more than half of that unimaginable sum just to defend its core journalistic practices and protect its staff from ruin. Yet, the financial toll tells only a fraction of the story, as the true cost was measured in the immense psychological and emotional strain that consumed the daily lives of the working journalists. For an agonizingly long period, 40 media professionals were forced to live under the direct threat of professional annihilation, knowing that their reputations, livelihoods, and entire life works were being called into question in the full glare of global publicity. They were dragged into an intensive 11-week court hearing, forced to stand in the witness box, and give an account of themselves under hostile, aggressive cross-examination. These were individuals who had spent decades uncovering truths for the public, suddenly finding themselves falsely accused of participating in illegal, career-destroying activities based on what would ultimately be revealed as entirely unsubstantiated allegations. The intensity of the courtroom drama reached its absolute peak during these testimonies, turning the high court into a high-stakes arena where the integrity of an entire media institution was micro-analyzed. It was during these grueling sessions that the foundational weakness of the claimant's case began to fracture under the steady weight of judicial scrutiny. While the coalition of high-profile individuals had entered the legal arena with a massive public relations fanfare promising to expose widespread wrongdoing, the actual substance of their evidence began to evaporate. Out of the 7 high-profile claimants who sought to bring the newspapers to their knees, almost all were found to possess remarkably limited direct evidence to support their dramatic public claims. The court heard how their primary witness, a notorious former private investigator named Gavin Burrows, suddenly and spectacularly withdrew his earlier statements, leaving the legal team of the claimants with virtually no credible foundation. Stripped of this critical testimony, the legal assault was reduced to a series of empty, unproven assertions that could not stand up to the rigorous standards of English common law, transforming their grand offensive into a desperate judicial gamble. In stark contrast to the crumbling narrative of the accusers, the journalists themselves delivered a series of remarkably compelling and grounded performances in the witness box. Mr. Justice Nicklin, in his massive and detailed written judgment, took the highly unusual and significant step of specifically singling out a number of the male reporters and editors, describing them as exceptionally honest, transparent, and impressive witnesses. This judicial praise acted as a powerful shield, completely restoring the professional honor of the individuals who had been subjected to months of public vilification and professional anxiety. For the broader team at Associated Newspapers, this was the ultimate validation of their workplace culture and the rigorous standards they maintain under intense commercial and social pressure. The contrast between the two sides in the courtroom could not have been more striking. While the celebrity claimants relied heavily on emotional appeals and historical grievances, the journalists relied on documented facts, clear recollections, and a transparent adherence to the law. Only a single witness from the entire claimant group, David Furnish, the husband of music icon Sir Elton John, managed to receive a positive assessment from the presiding judge. Highlights just how poorly the rest of the group performed under the bright lights of judicial cross-examination, to truly understand why the tension was so incredibly thick during this trial. One must look at the specific individuals whose historic achievements and massive public legacies were being directly targeted by this legal coalition. At the very center of the storm stood Paul Dacre, an iconic figure in modern media, who served as the formidable editor of the Daily Mail from 1992 until 2018, shaping the cultural and political discourse of the nation for over a quarter of a century. The claimants had leveled a deeply damaging and specific accusation against him, asserting that he had deliberately lied to the landmark Leveson inquiry back in 2012, when he gave sworn testimony that the Mail titles had never participated in or sanctioned the illegal practice of phone hacking. This was a calculated strike aimed at the absolute heart of his integrity, designed to rewrite the history of his editorship and brand him a perjurer on the global stage. For years, this dark cloud hung over Dacre and his colleagues, threatening to overshadow decades of award-winning investigative journalism and campaign successes that had defined his historic tenure. When Mr. Justice Nicklin comprehensively dismissed these groundless allegations, finding absolutely no truth in the assertions, it marked a historic moment of personal and professional vindication for a man who had dedicated his entire existence to the fierce defense of the printed press. However, the most deeply painful and emotionally charged aspect of this entire conspiracy involved the participation of Baroness Doreen Lawrence, the mother of Stephen Lawrence, a black teenager whose brutal murder by racist thugs in South London in 1993 remains one of the most significant social milestones in modern British history. In the years following that tragedy, when the official police investigations had completely foundered and the institutional authorities had failed to secure justice, it was Paul Dacre and the Daily Mail that took an extraordinary historic gamble by publishing their famous, iconic front page featuring the single unmistakable headline, "Murderers." This bold move, which named the prime suspects and challenged them to sue for libel, was immediately criticized by the comfortable political establishment and several rival newspapers who viewed it as a dangerous breach of convention. Yet, it was hailed by legendary legal minds like Lord Denning, the former master of the rolls, who described it as a marvelous, courageous piece of journalism that fought for truth and justice on behalf of an unprivileged, grieving family who had been utterly abandoned by the state apparatus. Given this deep, historic bond of shared struggle, it was a bitter, deeply confusing pill for the journalists to swallow when Baroness Lawrence was somehow persuaded to join the ranks of the media's fiercest enemies, accusing the very publication that fought for her son of targeting her with unlawful information-gathering techniques. The total dismissal of these specific claims by the judge finally lifted a heavy emotional burden from the newsroom, proving that the historic integrity of that legendary anti-racist campaign had never been compromised. The extraordinary collapse of the claims against Associated newspapers exposes a deeper, highly coordinated campaign that many industry experts have described as a deliberate, long-running conspiracy designed to completely muzzle the free press. These sensational legal actions did not simply appear out of nowhere. They were the direct result of an organized effort spearheaded by wealthy individuals who harbored a long-standing, deep-seated animosity toward investigative journalism. At the very forefront of this anti-press movement was the late Max Mosley, the former president of Formula One, who famously used his immense inherited fortune to fund groups dedicated to enforcing strict state oversight of newspapers. Mosley's fierce hatred for the publication intensified dramatically after the newspaper revealed that he had been the publisher of a deeply offensive, racist election pamphlet used decades prior by his father, the notorious British fascist leader Oswald Mosley. Consumed by a desire for revenge, Max Mosley utilized his vast wealth to bankroll organizations like Hacked Off, providing hundreds of thousands of pounds to individuals who actively sought out and paid witnesses to testify against the publication, creating a highly organized legal apparatus designed to crush editorial independence. The legacy of this highly funded campaign continued to influence the courtroom proceedings through figures like Dr. Evan Harris, a former Liberal Democrat member of Parliament and executive director of Hacked Off, who appeared as a key witness on behalf of the celebrity claimants. During the intense 11-week hearing, the fundamental credibility of these anti-press activists was thoroughly examined and ultimately shattered by the presiding judge, who described Dr. Harris as being particularly prone to an imaginative reconstruction of past events, rather than relying on verifiable facts. This judicial assessment exposed the true nature of the assault against the newspapers, revealing it to be a politically motivated crusade, masquerading as a search for accountability. Despite the immense public relations machinery deployed by these groups, the High Court verdict successfully unmasked their true objectives, proving that their ultimate goal was to establish a restrictive system of state control over the media landscape. By completely dismissing their arguments, the court delivered a heavy blow to these activist organizations, protecting the public's right to be informed about the actions of the wealthy and influential without government interference. Among the high-profile claimants who suffered a total defeat in this landmark case, Prince Harry stood out as the most prominent public figure to have his sweeping allegations entirely rejected by the High Court. The Duke of Sussex had engaged in a relentless, highly publicized 7-year campaign against the British press, launching multiple legal actions in an effort to fundamentally restructure how modern media organizations operate. While he had previously achieved limited victories against other media publishers, his aggressive legal strategy completely foundered against the solid defense presented by associated newspapers, resulting in an unmitigated disaster for his broader public campaign. Following the delivery of the sweeping 436-page judgment, the prince exhibited remarkable ill grace by publicly describing the definitive judicial ruling as an obvious whitewash, a statement that drew widespread criticism from legal scholars and media commentators alike. This bitter reaction highlighted his inability to accept the rigorous standards of evidence required by the court, and industry experts widely predict that this decisive defeat will finally force him to desist from his prolonged, exhausting legal warfare against traditional reporting institutions. The broader implications of this historic courtroom victory extend far beyond the walls of a single media house, representing a monumental triumph for the entire free press during an era of significant structural decline for printed journalism. Over the past 2 decades, newspapers across the globe have faced unprecedented economic challenges, battling falling circulations and navigating the difficult transition into a highly competitive digital marketplace. In this hostile economic climate, a negative verdict would have had catastrophic consequences, potentially unleashing a wave of ruinous litigation that could have forced prominent publications to close down permanently. By holding the line against this coalition of wealthy chancers and vindictive celebrities, the journalists and legal teams involved have secured a vital precedent that protects the investigative spirit for all publications. The ruling provides a massive, highly necessary boost to the morale of journalists everywhere, reassuring them that as long as they operate within the boundaries of the law, they possess the absolute right to scrutinize the actions of the rich, the powerful, and the politically connected without fearing institutional annihilation. However, despite the celebratory atmosphere sweeping through the media industry, seasoned editors and journalists are fully aware that this decisive victory does not mean the underlying warfare is over. The organizations that campaign for state control, alongside their ideological allies within the legislative branches, have already responded to the judgment by renewing their aggressive calls for a public inquiry into press standards, demonstrating an astonishing level of resilience in the face of total legal defeat. The threat of wealthy individuals utilizing the legal system to silence inconvenient reporting remains a constant, ever-present danger that requires unceasing vigilance from media organizations. There will always be rich and influential figures who seek to muzzle public scrutiny, and there will always be celebrities willing to advance false accusations to protect their carefully curated public images. While this particular battle has been won triumphantly, proving the immense integrity and honesty of the reporters who faced down these ruinous claims, the broader war to defend a free, independent press will continue indefinitely. requiring the same courage and steadfastness displayed throughout this historic trial.